This video isn't for everyone. I think I just uploaded it on my other channel, but I was gonna stay out of this, but I'm just really getting tired of someone that just won't take the blinders off and just won't stop attacking other people. It needs to take a step back and refuses to read and is listening to others. So I'm going to clear up some confusion. And, if you haven't got much time, speed it up, right? Because I want you to hear it, right? How Paul's argument, right, against idol food works, indoctrination and refutation of their practice because of its danger to fellow Christians, 8:1-13. And the bloke recognises that the major issues at stake were monotheism, adultery, election, holiness, and how these issues interact. Paul begins with his counter-argument in 8:1-6 by going back to first principles, the assertion of the Jewish-style monotheism, something the Corinthians would readily accept. He does not draw out, however, the full implications of what their monolithic confession and allegiance to one God entail unto 10:1-22. He introduced the dispute over idol food by establishing common ground. We Christians know that God is one and that idols have no existence despite their many adherents. He builds on the conscience about the non-existence of idols and introduce two key principles that will inform his argument. First, Christian love is to override knowledge, and that feeds arrogance. Second, Christian monotheism defines who the people of God are distinct from those who worship many gods and lords. Second principle undergirds that all Paul says against eating idol food, but he develops the first principle in this unit. Mentioning Christ in the confession in 8:6 recalls God, the supreme act of love that made Christians a unique people. Christ died for them, 8:11. The act of love that brought them to God. Family requires that they respond to others with family, and the family with love, putting others' needs and interests ahead of their own. In other words, service to other, not service to self. In 8:7-13, Paul explores the potential effect of the knowers eating idol food on a fellow believer who may not have the same level of theological sophistication to rationale such behavior or to apprehend the theological consequences. He assumes that as a Christian they have a loving concern for others and do not wish to lead them into sin. His first argument against eating idol food is his assertion that their actions are not neutral but may cause another Christian to stumble or fall. He presents the hypothetical example. The emphasis is on if a fellow Christian observes another Christian esteemed as a person of knowledge eating food in an idol setting, 8:10. The other Christian is identified as programmed by habitation to think in a certain way about sacrificed food, about having a weak conscience. The conscience is not the inner voice which warns us that somebody may be looking, as the American humorist journalist H.L. McCacken defines it. Paul used the term to refer to that factually moral evaluation that adjudicates whether an individual's actions are right or wrong and directs the behavior according to recognized norms. It is a moral compass. A panel from the American cartoon Dennis the Menace unexpectedly captures what Paul means. Consigned to sit in the corner as punishment for some misbehavior, he reflects, I got some bad advice from my conscience. The conscience compromises the depository of an individual's morals, beliefs, and principles that make judgments about what is right and wrong. A weak conscience is one that is unable to make appropriate moral judgments because of the lack of proper education. Erickson points out that weakness was used in the philosophical schools for the moral sickness suffered by those recent converts who were not yet able to make correct moral judgments. A weak conscience is prone to give assent to false judgments and sanction actions based on a faulty criteria, particularly when it has been defiled. It is untrustworthy because it does not possess the necessary knowledge. The Christian with a weak conscience does not have the knowledge to make correct moral judgments. Paul worries that the person might follow the example of those presumed to have knowledge but eat food as they truly offered an idol that is a sacrificial act. He will lead astray in his moral judgment to think that it is permissible for Christians to pay homage to both Christ and pagan deities. His conscience is then defiled through adultery, which is taken to a compass becoming demagnetized so that it no longer points to the true north. Paul is anxious that the Christians in this example will be sucked back into the vortex of adultery and face spiritual ruination. He concludes with a hyperbolic example of what he would do to avert such a catastrophe. He would abstain from eating meat altogether. 8:13. Love may require giving up things that one reads as right for the sake of preventing other Christians from falling. But the principle is not Paul's final word on the matter. It is simply his opening salvo that asks the Corinthians to consider aspects of a problem they had overlooked. 2. Paul's own example to undergird his counsel, 9:1-27. The choppy transition from the discussion of the idol food in chapter 8 to the right of the apostle to receive aid from a congregation has caused some to suspect that this section beginning 8:13 or 9:1 represents interpolation or unconnected digression. Most now recognize that this section is integral to Paul's argument about idol food, and takes a step further in 9:1-27. Paul develops the example of his own behavior. Everything he does, including not exercising his rights as an apostle, is aimed at winning others to the gospel and avoiding anything that might necessarily hinder another from coming to the faith. Some contend that Paul is defending himself against the word of criticism, shaking the Corinthians' confidence in his apostleship. Something that surfaces in 2 Corinthians is explanatory question. Am I not apostle? Sounds defensive. And his statement, this is my defense, apology to those who would examine me, 9:3, seems plain enough to support his view. It may seem Paul unleashes a tyrant of rhetorical questions that vigorously defend his apostolic right to receive support in response to his detractors who suggest that he did not have the right. He then offers his rationale for having waived the right. Rhetorical questions, however, do not indicate that the writer has adopted a defensive mode. They simply invite the audience to give its opinion. They are part of Paul's style. In a portion of the letter, 6 occur in 10:14-22, also 8:10-10:30. It's unlikely that Paul is in the defensive in this unit. First, the notion of his apostleship only appears in 9:1-2, in which he establishes his right to earn material support. These remarks are too brief for substance defense. The rest of his argument appeals to everyday examples of the soldier, farmer, shepherd, 9:7, the plowman, the thresher, 9:10, the priest, 9:13. These illustrations simply point to the universal norm that every person ought to profit from his labor. The authority of the law, 9:8-10, Deuteronomy 25:4, a precedent of others who have already received the benefactions from the Corinthians 9:12a, and the command of Jesus 9:14. Further buttresses the right of an apostle who labors in the gospel to earn his living from the gospel. These arguments do not furnish support for Paul's apostolic standing, but simply remind readers that everybody knows and establishes the point that apostles have the right to be supported. Second, rhetorical questions that could just as easily be answered negatively would hardly win the day in defense. Apparently, Paul did not expect the Corinthians to contest the points because he phrased the first 4 questions in 9:1 and expected affirmative answer. The question, am I not apostle, does not challenge any misgivings about his apostle rank, but instead establishes an outset to the premise of his discussion. He is entitled as an apostle to receive support, as they must admit, but they know that he has waived those rights. He is not asserting his rights in this section, but is hammering home the reunification of them. His statement at 9:15 that he does not write to secure his due rights for financial backing assumes that they would pay him if he would accept it. Third, if the Corinthians did not regard him as a true apostle, he wastes his time describing at length his refusal to use his rights as an apostle. The key assertion comes in 9:19, where he maintains that he is free for all men, 9:1, not that he is an apostle. Fourth, Fitzmiller invertedly highlights a problem with the view that Paul is on the defensive with these comments. We would have expected Paul to provide further details as opponents compared to Galatians 1, 6, 7, 5, and 10. But conclusive evidence is lacking. We lack sufficient information about specific charges Paul's opponents are levelling against him. The most obvious reasons for paucity of the details is that there were none to give. No one in Corinthian were raising charges against him related to his refusal to receive support. Fifth, the focus in this section falls on the rights and waiving of the rights. It develops an issue raised in 8:9. Paul's development in the theme of 9:19 to 23 further explains that he set aside his own advantages for the sake of others. The argument in this section establishes a high status to set to the stage of willing to acceptance of low status. Martin contains low status persons. The weak, by definition, have no excuse here to surrender. The things connected with the high status, rights and freedoms are the very things that those who have recoil at surrendering. This is Paul's point. The overall argument is intended to promote a certain kind of demeanour and conduct. Having established his rights, he can then feature his refusal to profit from them. Finally, it's all a strange defence of his apostleship for Paul to point out several respects in which he was not acted like an apostle. Why he cited a command of the Lord in 9:14 that seems to undermine this position. If the problem is that some have disparaged him for failing to live according to the standard ordained by Jesus, Paul says nothing to offset this perception. The best answer to these questions is that Paul is not on the defense on the insisting of his apostolic rights. Instead, he insists that his renouncing these apostolic rights is the right thing to do for the one captured by Christ. He is controlled by a necessity to win others to Christ. That is his calling as apostate imposes upon him. It is not by any selfish desire to promote his own advantage or to indulge in his own fancy. He cites his own practice as an example or attitude he wants them to adopt. The task of advancing the gospel totally dominates his life, inspiring his willingness to make any sacrifice to win others. He wishes that this attitude was more evident in their lives. That Paul intends in this section to offer himself as a model of one who voluntarily relinquishes his rights is confirmed by the athletic metaphor that spotlights on his own conduct, 9:24 to 27, and the concluding abomination to imitate him, then he imitates Christ, 11:1. He uses autobiographical information to establish the ethos to persuade. Holiday notes that using ethical paragraphs was typical of Greco-Roman moralists who believed that the example was far superior to precept, and a logical analysis of a mean of illustrating and reinforcing appears to pursue a particular mode of life and normally the life of reverent virtue. They would present themselves as paradigms for their audience to follow. Paul's personal example as apostate was unselfishly sacrifices for others in his ministerial service is particularly appropriate for the Corinthians, who have demonstrated a tendency to seek their personal gain. By contrast, the Corinthians appear to insist on the right that might cause the weak to stumble. Paul purposely surrenders a right and adapts himself to the weak, 9:22, and to others to win them. The implication that those with knowledge should follow his example by abdicating their so-called right to eat idle food, 8:9, so that they would avoid any possibility of causing others without their endowment of knowledge from falling back into idolatry. The issue of food appears in 9, 4, 7, 9, 10, 13, and reveals that he does not ask them to give up any more than himself has given up. Knowledge 8.1, rights 8.9, and freedom 9.1 must be directed by love and concern for the spiritual well-being of others. The sports analogy in 9:24 to 27 makes the point that the Christian life requires effort at the suppression of appetites and longings. It allows him to play on the Corinthians' craving for honour and contrast in the ephemeral reward to bestow on the winner of an athletic contest of the eternal prize that God will award the Christian the vicar. The prolonged, rigorous training required for success in athletics competition was a well-known image in the ancient world, and it sheds light on his own voluntary restraint in refusing to exercise his apostate rights so that he may successfully attain his goal of saving others. The metaphorical language may cloak how it applies to Corinthians' status, but it's all part of his argument that believers should abstain from sacrificial meals. The images of an athletic competitor enduring a rigorous training regime, running determinedly, and bruising the body to bring it under rein disclose that Paul is not asking the Corinthians knowers to try to be more discreet when they join any festivities on idols' grounds to protect their weak brother. He expects them to abandon any and all such participation. Paul cites the catchphrase, "Everything is permitted," in 10:23 and 6:12, but he first emphasizes that everything is not permitted by the athlete who hopes to win. Christian life involves the limitation as well as the enjoyment of freedom. The athletic smile also serves as a transition to the warning example of Israel in the next section 10:1 to 13. It warns that any who fail to exercise self-restraint when it comes to the delights of this world may be disqualified from the ultimate race directed by God. It is more than general warning against complacency. It reminds the Corinthians of difficulties in living out their Christian commitment. Entry into the contest does not guarantee a prize, and they cannot repose in an illusion that they are safe from failure. Okay. The argument about the wilderness. Ow. Sorry, I just had a bone go. Ow. That hurt. Refutation of their practice from the negative example of the history of Israel in the wilderness. In 10:1-13, Paul turns up the heat of his argument against idol food by appearing to a negative example from Israel's history. The move from personal example to extended biblical exposure again makes 10:1-13 appear to be a digression, but it fits perfectly with his purpose. Israel's demise in the wilderness is directly applicable to Christians in Corinthians. The Father's horrifying end in the desert highlights the peril of the Corinthians' risk by consorting with idols, violating their convent obligations and putting the Lord to test as suicidal. Through the Father's experience divine provisions, the presence of Christ, and the prefigurement of baptism and Lord Supper, they failed to enter the promised land because of their adultery. Therefore, there's a direct warning to the Corinthians, since Paul underscores the scriptures directly applies to them. Of the four warnings of the wilderness experience adduced in this section, Paul quotes only one passage. The people sat down to eat, drink, and rose up to play. Exodus 20:32-6. He fears this one verse because it ties into the theme of eating and drinking that reverberates through the chapters 8-10. It is suggested that he does not cite the verse emphasizing their worship and sacrifice before the calf, for example, Exodus 32:6a, 8:31-35, but chooses to instead cite their eating, drinking, and playing that followed their sacrifice. 3 comments that text specifically indicates that the people ate in the presence of the golden calf. He infers from this that adultery for Paul is a matter of eating cultic meals in an idol present. While Paul's concern is not limited to only Christians eating in an idol setting, this connection reveals that he's certainly regarding eating in the presence of an idol is idolatry. The point should be clear to the Corinthians. If they dally at pagan feasts, they can expect the same fate as Israel in the wilderness. They are not to be cravers of evil, 10:6, or adulterers, 10:7a, and are not to put the Lord to test, 10:9, or grumble, 10:10, if they expect their relationship to God to remain secure. The bold Corinthians may not fear the power of idols, but they should fear the wrath of God. They cannot gauze that being forbidden from participating in idol feasts places them under the untenable position. If they are faithfully exclusively to God, then they will never be in a situation too difficult for God to sustain them and empower them to endure, 10:13. The refutation of their practice from examples of the Lord's Supper, 10:14-22. In the unit, Paul strikes directly by commanding them to flee adultery, 10:14, and connecting idol foods to demon. He refutes their practice by appealing to the example of the Lord's Supper and the danger of serial fellowship. As the Lord's Supper is a sacred meal that represents and creates fellowship of believers and the worship of Christ, who is considered to be present, so pagan meals represents and creates a fellowship of worshippers of pagan deities who are also considered to be present. Idols, however, represent the realm of the demonic. Participating in one meal preludes participating in another. Believers should not fool themselves into thinking that they are strong enough to try to merge the two meals, to affiliate with Christ and demons. To attempt to do so only kindles the jealousy and the judgment of God. Practical advice for dealing with the issue of idol food in the pagan setting. The question of the temple dining and eating food sacrificed to idols is now left aside as Paul addresses the question of food questionable origins. Food that may have been sacrificed to idols before it comes into the hands of a believer. To answer the question how a Christian can act with integrity in a world brimming with idols, he moves from absolute prohibition based on general arguments about the dangers of associating with anything adulterous to the conditional liberty based on the biblical tenet that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, 10:26, Psalms 24:1. He gives the go-ahead on everything that is beyond an idol's orbit. It is not permanently poisoned. Paul clarifies that food is food and permissible to eat unless it's specifically identified as idol food, which puts it in a special category that is always forbidden to Christians. They need not to abstain from food on the chance that it may have been sacrificed to idols. He basically says, of course you can buy food in the provision market. Of course you can dine with friends. His prohibition of idol food does not mean that they must retreat to the seclusion of the gloomy ghetto. Nevertheless, he anticipates potential problems presented by food that Christians might purchase from the market or food that a Christian might eat in the home of an unbeliever who might have offered it to idols. Smart contends that Paul's shift in 10:23:11:1 from the discussion about the idol offerings to adjacent issue transgresses an important rhetorical rule. The transgression may have made his prohibitions easier to digest, but it does not go unpunished by the misunderstanding of his later interpretations. He thinks that in 10:23:11:1 refers to the idol offerings mentioned in 8:1. The shift also leads interpreters to suggest that Paul's contradicting himself or to conjure confusion is created by the latter improlation. Many mistakenly assume that in this section Paul encourages the weak to ease up their criticisms on the so-called strong. Paul states that he now asks the weak to do something for the strong, namely to begin to free themselves from tyrannical scruples. Nowhere does Paul mention the weak in the section or talk about scruples, let alone tyrannical scruples. In the maximum, all things are permissible, which Paul amends with the emphasis on what is beneficial, and he builds up hardly seems appropriate for launching a response of the so-called weak. Paul wrongly claims that Paul belongs to the strong, and his abrupt challenge to the weak he speaks not only for himself but also for those who see themselves as strong in the Corinthian. He has just declared that he identifies with the weak in 9:22, not the so-called strong. Even if the argument that the person with a weak conscience is a hypothetical construct was incorrect, how could Paul encourage them to take a more relaxed view towards food when he expressed concern that they are extremely vulnerable to reverting to their former adulterous practices in 8:10? This section is directed to the whole church, but if Paul were addressing a particular group, it would be the knowers that they are most likely to seek their own advantage to be invited to a banquet in the unbeliever's home and object to another's conscience of constricting their liberty. Paul permits buying food in the marketplace that may or may have not been sacrificed in a pagan temple, but if its history is disclosed and it's announced to be idol food, then he forbids eating it. He permits dining with friends who may be worshippers of idols, but if the food is announced to be idol food, then he forbids eating it. Christians may not participate in any functions that overtly smacks of idolatry. He basically defines what idol food is in a doubtful case when it's not specified as idol food. All food outside of the idol's orbit is permitted, so he gives them leave to eat anything sold in the public market without investigating its history to certify that it is free from any adulterous contamination. Christ has not called them to be meat inspectors outside of its adulterous context. Idol food becomes simply food and belongs to the one God, Romans 14:14. Their ruling is far more liberal than one found in Mishnah that states flesh that is entering in unto an idol is permitted, but what comes forth is forbidden. When giving this advice about buying food in the provision markets or dining at a private gathering, Paul again mentions the conscience, buy or eat, without inquiring about its history because of conscience, 10:25-27. In the first case, it's not clear whose conscience is imbued, the purchaser or the observer. Many conclude that he has in mind the bad feelings of the weak who might spot a fellow Christian in a compromising position. In the scenario, Paul advises them to ignore the weak Christian's misgivings. This interpretation mistakenly reads into the text the presumed conflict between the so-called strong and weak. Paul is not mediating that imagined conflict, but offering general advice to all Christians about buying and eating food sold in the provisional market. He recognizes that perceptions about idols are real. In an intermediate context, Paul has raised their consciousness that idols' food is hazardous by the material by linking it to demons. This new consciousness of the danger attached to idol food may encumber the decisions about purchasing food in the market that might have come from the temple sacrifices, and counsels them not to brood on that decision. He counsels them to buy and eat whatever you like and can afford. Idol food is not as dangerous outside of its overtly adulterous context. To ask questions about the food's history in the open market would be an unnecessary burden to their conscience. In this case, ignorance is bliss. It is not simply that what you don't know won't hurt you, but why worry needlessly about something that is clearly a matter of indifference? In the same way, they need not worry that the marriage of an unbeliever might somehow contaminate the believer. 17:14. They need not worry that they will be contaminated by the food that may have pagan attendees. The premise behind the instruction comes in Psalms 24:1, which is in Judaism shaped the prayer voiced before a meal. It affirms that God is sovereign over all things, 8:6, and that everything created by God is good, 1 Timothy 4:4. The whole creation belongs to God, not part of God and part to idols. The idol food, therefore, loses its character as idol food as soon as it leaves the idol's arena and the adulterous purposes. Paul does not complete the thought with the conclusion that the biblical citation, but it's simply nothing is unclean in itself, Romans 14:14, Acts 10:15. If it can be eaten in the honor of the Lord, Romans 14:7, it is permitted. What Paul finds sinful is eating idol food in any setting that might give others the slightest hint that Christians sanction adultery, no matter how unintended the religious aspects attached to the meal or the place might be. In the second sense, Paul adds a caveat. If someone should say to you, this food is sacrificed to the gods, do not eat it out of concern for the one who informed you because of conscience. He identifies the conscience as belonging to the one who makes the declaration, but only gives sketchy details about its information. Who is it, why he speaks, or how his conscience would be jeopardized is most likely from what follows that Paul envisions a pagan making the announcement. Ultimately, it makes no difference. The result is the same. The case is hypothetical, offering instructions on how a Christian should respond in a pagan surrounding, and there is no need to identify or to tangle the motives of the informer. Most likely, the host proclaims his intentions about the food, but it could be anyone who makes such an announcement. The declaration makes clear the meal's atmosphere is distinguished by the act of the adulterous piety. Paul instructs them not to eat this because of the one who makes the disclosure and because of the conscience. He clarifies in 10:29 that he refers to the conscience as the one who makes the announcement, not the believer who accepted the invitation. What does the word conscience mean here? It is a slippery word whose meaning was a flux. Many assume that it must refer to the weak conscience of a fellow believer in 8:7 or 10:12. But Paul says nothing about the conscience being weak or in danger of being wounded, 8:12. It may simply mean that the person who makes the announcements is conscious that the food is religiously sufficient. Paul formulates a key hermeneutical principle underlying his advice. The food's past history only matters when it matters to someone else who considers it sacred. Christians may know that idols do not exist, or that there is no God but one, and that all the food belongs ultimately to God. It is a sticky situation. However, it is not their conscience that counts, but the other. His approach to the issue is very close to that of the rabbis. Okay. Yeah, I'll gotta leave the links in the description for you, but some might listen to it, some might not. But, if someone asks that question, and there's the answer. Thanks for watching. Bye.